of everything as we see it right here, right now. But we all know that the world of freight, the world of logistics is highly dynamic. So please take it for what it is and don't hold us accountable for anything. Today, I'm represented with my two great colleagues, Kaitlyn Glancy, who runs North America for Flexport, and Nerijus Poskus, who runs our ocean strategy and carrier development here at Flexport. Super excited to spend the next 45 minutes with the two of them and picking their brain on their best advice for how to navigate the RFP and bid season ahead of us. First off, before we get into the details, just a few practicalities on the app right here in front of you, in case it's the first time you're attending one of our webinars. And you'll see a few features in the app, a chat box where you can ask any question. If you learn something in the presentation, feel free to follow up with a question. We have some Flexporters attending the webinar that are able to basically give you answers to either of your questions. So please add them right in there. You also have an opportunity to download the slide deck right here. If you're like, that was interesting, I want to deep dive that slide, then you can just download the PDF and share it with whomever you'd like to share it with. I think that's about it. And as always, feel free to follow up to either three of us after the webinar if you have any particular questions to the three of us. Now, let's take a look at the agenda. As usual, pretty simple. First off, we'll take a pulse check at the market. What have we seen up until today, and what do we expect in the near term? We're not going to try and predict the future because that's pretty hard, but at least we're going to talk about the trends we're seeing ahead of us. Then we'll talk about what to expect in the RFP season this year, what's different from normal, and what do we expect this year. And then finally, Kaitlyn, Nerijus, and myself will come with our best sort of recommendations as to how to navigate the bid season this year. Now, what are we seeing ahead of us in terms of freight rates, transit times, and whatnot? I think everybody who has been involved in the world of logistics and supply chains the past couple of years have been on a wild ride. We've seen unprecedented freight rates, transit times, delays, bottlenecks, and whatnot. But reality is that we are now back to a more normalized environment when we look at both freight rates and transit times. As you can see on the visual right here, it's pretty much correlated. This is the picture for most of the trade lanes on the Trans-Pacific lanes, on Asia-Europe. We do see pockets of trade lanes like the transatlantic, so everything going from Europe to North America, that are still at elevated levels, both when it comes to freight rates and to some extent transit times. Transatlantic is still double up freight rates relative to normal. But as you see right here, Trans-Pacific, Asia-Europe, and other lanes are pretty much back to normal when it comes to both freight rates and end-to-end transit times. What's interesting when we look at the current snapshot of freight spend and what we expect for 2023 is that we have seen some changes in the total freight spend breakdown relative to what we've seen the past couple of years. Nerijus, help us dumb down what we're seeing right here.
Thank you, Anders. Quite simple. What we see is main freight is now significantly smaller portion of the total cost. And prices are also a lot more transparent, meaning the min and the max between Shanghai and Los Angeles is barely any different, with an exceptions of premium services. So what does it mean is that industry players have to either add and sell value or get more creative when it comes to making money. We all get unsolicited rate offers via LinkedIn or an email that look too good to be true. And when you look up the company name, you all of a sudden you see they don't even have an FMC license. So what are the things you need to look out for in that bucket of the ocean freight, right? When you see low rates on ocean freight, especially if it's prepaid or paid in Asia, you very often will see much higher destination costs that are charged by a different company if you're Incoterms or CFR or CIF. Destination and origin fees also have, or destination and origin can have a lot of hidden fees. It's not additional fees. If they're listed on your code, it's fine because you know what you're getting into, but it's more the hidden fees like the chassis splits that hasn't been quoted, doctor turnover fee that hasn't been quoted, chassis minimum days, congestion that's not there anymore, import service fees, or in some cases even a fee management fees that I've seen in my career. So a few more things about this slide is it's not just ocean freight, it's also the rail costs. They are not listed on this website, but they are still similar to 2021 and 2022, meaning they are elevated, which in cases makes transloading more attractive. And the last point in this one is if you drill down in the 50% of ocean freight, if you exclude BAF or fuel, destination terminal handling, the US, which is included in ocean freight, the actual ocean freight is less than 25% for port-to-port move, which means when it comes to negotiations, it doesn't really move the needle that much, just the pure port-to-port rate. So my note here is take a look at real door-to-door cost.
Thanks, Nerijus. Super insightful. Wow, a fee management fee. I haven't heard that one before. To keep an eye out for. Okay, if we take a look at the general supply demand balance, it's also very clear that there is more supply than demand out there. That's been the case for the past 6 to 9 months, which is very different and upside down from what we saw the past 2 years during the COVID economy. And we are also expecting there to be enough supply or enough space relative to demand the coming year, unless we, of course, have a lot of unforeseen black swan events. So essentially, more supply than demand out there. Carriers are actively managing their vessels, their supply, blanking, voiding, and pausing sailings whenever possible to make sure that they have somewhat healthy utilization levels and essentially can defend their cost picture. So that's the idea on like how it's looking sort of at the global level. But again, the devil's always in the detail, week for week, port pair for port pair. But this is the high level picture we're seeing right here. Let's zoom in on consumer demand trends and sales to inventory levels. Kaitlyn, help us understand what we're seeing right here in some of the statistics and also what you're hearing from your clients.
Yeah, absolutely, Anders. So, I mean, what we're seeing right here is, of course, as most of us know, the American consumer in particular went a little crazy in the back half of 2020, all the way into the early half of 2022, buying more things than we could ever possibly need, buying new houses, furnishing those houses, buying electronics, outdoor equipment, pretty much anything and everything. And the result of that is that everybody started importing a lot more in order to meet that customer demand. That customer demand started pulling back in the back half of last year and obviously into the early part of this year with rising interest rates, concerns about an economic pullback, of course, most recently, some concerns about banking. And so all of that has led to a mismatch today between the inventory that our clients all have on hand here in the US and really what the American consumer is spending and buying in today's world.
Kaitlyn, super insightful. Let's hear from the audience. We have a lot of shippers dialing into this webinar, so it's always good with a pulse check from the room on how you're seeing it. Let's test Kaitlyn's statement right here to see if she's right. Essentially, we'd like to ask you all this question: what are your current inventory levels? Do you have way too much? Do you have too much on hand? Do you have what you need, give or take? Do you have too little, or do you have way too little? Please select one of the 5, and then let's see what the outcome is in, say, 10 seconds or so. Take your time. All right, let's have a look. Super interesting. So it's still moving up here, but I think it looks like, give or take, 60% or so have too much inventory on hand. It's still moving a little bit, but yeah, 62% too much inventory on hand, and then a third have what they need. We actually asked the very same question in another Flexport webinar 3 months ago. Let's take a look at those results right here, just for comparison. It's actually pretty similar. At that point in time, 63% said they had too much inventory. We now saw 62%, so very similar. At that point in time, 31% said that they had what they need. We now see 31. So by and large, same results. Now, let's hear from you, Kaitlyn. Is this surprising? Had you expected a change relative to 3 months ago, or?
It's not too surprising, although, when we did this in December and saw 63% had too much inventory on hand, it's been a huge, huge focus, I know, for importers, supply chain managers to work on those inventory levels and bring them down. So I was really expecting to see something perhaps in the 50% saying they think they had too much inventory on hand. So 62%. So maybe we've seen some marginal improvement there, but it is consistent overall with what I'm seeing and hearing from all of our clients here in the US and Canada, that they all still do. A lot of them have too much inventory on hand. And usually what we're seeing is, across our client base and their portfolio of products, there are SKUs that are still selling through at a decent and consistent basis. So whether that's new product launches or hot SKUs or things that are a little bit differentiated, those products are still moving their way through out of their warehouses. A lot of clients, though, are still sitting on some of their traditional SKUs, the ones that are a bit slow moving or potentially non-moving. And those are some of the SKUs that they start bringing in first or middle part of 2022 that we're still sitting on. Of course, those SKUs all have high, landed costs associated with them as well. So everybody's focus right now is really on managing their inventory levels in their warehouses. If you had to open up a secondary warehouse to manage overflow, ideally closing that secondary warehouse and getting back into a one warehouse where inventory is flowing through faster and sales are matching your current inventory levels on hand.
Yeah, great point. And I'm with you, Kaitlyn. I was actually also a little bit surprised. I had thought that the number would have come down to 50%.
Yeah, I was hoping for everybody we see it at least 50s or below, but we still have work to do, it sounds like.
Okay, let's take a look at sort of the expectations for the future in terms of how you all see your forecasts in terms of volume and shipments. So one more question here for the audience. When do you expect to see an uptake in volume and bookings? In other words, a peak season for you. Are you looking at April to June, July through September, October through December? Do you expect volume, bookings, shipments to remain somewhat steady relative to what you have going at the moment? Or do you actually expect a drop relative to what you're currently booking out there? Love to learn from all of you. Pick one of the 5, and we'll see in 10 seconds from now what the outcome is. All right, let's have a look. Interesting. The results are still settling. But in the meantime, Nerijus, let's hear from you. Is this to you?
No, it's surprising that that quite a lot of people are expecting a peak during traditional peak season months, which is coming back to school, right? Which is July through September, which tells me that the next few months are probably going to be slow, so we can burn through all the excess inventory that importers have, and then we are going to hit potentially the peak season in July and September. Now, 20% or so are saying that they expect a sort of a peak season from April to June. That's interesting. That's probably going to be a peak season for those companies, but I don't necessarily see a peak season at that time for us as an industry. So for those importers, it's probably good news. Peak season for you doesn't mean higher rates. Back to you, Anders.
Kaitlyn, surprising to you?
No, it's consistent with the trends that I've been seeing and talking to all of our Flexport clients about, that, inventory levels are still quite high, focus is on selling through that amount of inventory, but it sounds like everybody is expecting a back half and picking up their orders with their suppliers, starting in Q3, Q4. So that is certainly consistent that this, at least all of our attendees today are saying they are hopeful that they will start placing more orders, seeing more bookings coming through for new SKUs or, replenished SKUs coming Q3, Q4. I do think that's valuable for everybody that's thinking about their strategy for, do I sign a fixed rate? Do I sign a floating rate for the year? If kind of everybody's expecting an uptick in the back half of the year, I think that's an important part of the strategy. And I know we're going to chat a little bit about that, but I do think that that plays into certain types of client strategies for how much are they going to sign on a fixed rate, a floating rate, depending on how important some of those inventory and products are for them.
Yeah, that's a great point, Kaitlyn, which is a good pivot into the next chapter of the webinar right here. So let's move on and take a look at the bid season and strategies the same. So it's actually not that complex. There are sort of four sort of buckets of opportunities for how to go about your volume, right? When it comes to contracting terms. Kaitlyn, help us understand sort of how they work and how they're different.
Yeah, so I'll walk through the four options, and then Nerijus, I'm going to make you chat about that last index base, but I'll take a stab at the first three here. In terms of rate options that our clients have and that we're chatting with everybody about right now is, your fixed annual rate. So that's saying, hey, I move 2,000 containers from China to the US West Coast. Let's just put it all on a fixed annual rate. The benefits, of course, of a fixed rate are it's consistent, it's fixed. You can plan and manage, your costs and your expectations internally against that rate. That's great if you have good, consistent volume, a limited number of trade lanes, and high volume on each of those trades. So that is a great option for some importers. A number of clients that we're working with right now, the floating market, just playing the spot market, is working really well. The spot market is low and continues to get even lower each day. It seems like almost to concerning low levels, but playing the floating market, getting the rates that you need at the time that you need it, taking advantage of the low rates in the market right now. And perhaps if you're expecting some big product launches or upticks in the back half of the year, taking advantage of the floating market at that time, even though it might be a bit more expensive at that time, but just playing alongside the market, taking advantage of low rates now, maybe be willing to pay a little bit more if they get higher in the back half of the year. The third option here that seems to be quite a popular option right now is just a mix of fixed and floating. So taking some portion of your volume that is going to be consistent weekly or consistent monthly volume out of consistent suppliers going into consistent warehouses, putting that portion on a fixed contract so you have good reliability there in your cost and planning strategy, and then taking the other portion that maybe you're not so sure about yet what the plan is going to be, if there's going to be any delays, like I said, in where it's in product launches, maybe doing that on the floating market. So that seems to be quite a popular option right now. Customer conversations can be anywhere. Do I do 50% fixed, 50% floating, maybe 70-30, 30-70? So really this strategy does depend on your supply chain, what makes the most sense for your business and your plans for the year. And then I'll turn it over to Nerijus for this fourth index-based option.
Thanks, Kaitlyn. Index pricing is really not a rocket science. It's just an agreed pricing with set of rules for the future. In theory, it can be weekly, monthly, quarterly, or even one-year prices. Or essentially, for example, a 3-year price is indexed yearly. It saves everybody time. It sort of builds trust because you don't have to price check every single week. Let's say if you're on spot prices, right? Every time you have to ask multiple forwarders for prices, you have to compare them. Sometimes one is more competitive, another one is another one. So instead, if you agree on some sort of an index, as long as an index is trusted by both parties, it simply works. Your prices, let's take an example. If you're shipping from Shanghai to New York and you're paying whatever, $2,500, and then you agree on an index. An index is Shanghai Containerized Freight Index, as an example. And your index price drops by 200. In 2 weeks, you just get a discount. If the index goes up, you get a surcharge. So like I said, it simply saves time. It's also not necessarily a new concept. It has been in the market on Asia, Europe for years. It's simply less common on Trans-Pacific or other trade lanes, but we do see more and more interest popping up on the Trans-Pacific. And in my opinion, if there is demand, supply will follow, hence index is becoming more popular. It's still a very small portion of the market. If I had to guess, less than 2% of Trans-Pacific volumes are moving on an indexed today.
Yeah, which is interesting because if you look at Asia Europe, it's probably like a third of the market moving on that, right? So I would agree with everything you're saying right here, Nerijus. I think it is a good alternative if you want sort of that assurance of getting the space, getting the capacity, but you're fine with a more fluctuating rate, which at the moment is to your advantage given the lower floating rates. It is a good option to get sort of fixed capacity, but at a floating rate. So yeah, always good for you to learn more about this option from your providers. Okay, let's take a look at what to expect. Nobody can, of course, predict exactly where the fixed rates are going to land. If they can, then please give me their name. Now, what are we seeing and what are we expecting based on the trends we're hearing? It's all settling the next 6 weeks up until May 1st, where the new contracts, the new fixed rates come into effect on the Trans-Pacific market. What do we expect? Now, if you take a look at the visual here, you can see that the blue line at the top is essentially the index of the fixed rates from last year's contracts. Those were the fixed rates relative to the floating rates that we're seeing right here in the green. So quite the spread, right? At the same time, we also all know that not necessarily all of the freight on the fixed contract moved on those very rates because there are a lot of surcharges being added, right? Nevertheless, we expect, the fixed rates this year to drop by give or take 70% relative to the contracted rates we saw at this point in time last year. Now, a 70% reduction, that's pretty good. But we also know that it was at record high levels we've never seen before. And it's still clear that the fixed rates we expect to settle the coming 6 weeks will be higher than the current floating levels. In fact, 30% higher. Nobody knows yet. It's, again, devil's in the detail, lane by lane, trade by trade, but we expect by and large the market to settle around 30% higher than the current floating levels. That 30%, that's a lot, but you could also argue that the current floating levels are somewhat unsustainable. We know that it's at loss-giving levels for the carriers. It's at lower levels than their cost picture because they have higher costs than pre-pandemic because of the increase in charter rates or lease rates for basically the vessels, as well as the bunker cost and whatnot. So nevertheless, that's what we're seeing right here. Nobody knows how it's going to land, but this is sort of our best prediction for now at the high level. But let's zoom in and learn a little bit more about the different scenarios, floating versus fixed. Nerijus, help us understand what we see right here in terms of the different scenarios.
Yeah, sure. So scenario number one is that fixed rates are higher than floating, which is what Anders mentioned. Quite likely that is going to happen in the next few weeks. It's, again, not an unlikely scenario. In this scenario, we would see a lot of service cancellations, a lot of service changes. Capacity will be probably reduced significantly. Essentially, carriers in this scenario would do anything they can to reduce that gap between spot and fixed. Otherwise, there is simply too much pressure from large BCOs on the fixed contracts, which carriers can't allow to happen. So instead, they would do, like I said, anything they can to work on supply to reduce that gap. So that's the number one. Number two is fixed essentially equals floating on average. This kind of means we're back to pre-pandemic, not every year, but more or less rates are very similar on fixed and floating, with the exception of when Hanjin went bankrupt and a few other years. Is generally a good outcome for all players, more or less. Carriers don't need to blank too much because it means there is supply and demand equilibrium. It doesn't mean that there is no surplus capacity as a whole globally, but deployed capacity, right? So let's kind of hope the second one happens. The third one is that floating is higher than fixed. That scenario can happen if carriers pull too much capacity out because the spot rates are too low. And in this case, fixed contracts are at risk if you were not supporting them before the spot market was low, right? Essentially how this works is allocation in this scenario is always based on past performance. It could be an average of 4 weeks or 8 weeks, but this scenario is also not completely unlikely. It actually was what happened early 2020 when COVID hit. All of you, or many of you, have canceled the low orders, which meant demand plummeted and then capacity was reduced. And let's not hope this happens, but it is not an unlikely scenario. So let's watch and hope for the second scenario, which will be best for all.
Very clear, Nerijus. Let me put you on the spot right here. Which of the three scenarios do you think is the most likely?
It's probably the first one, but through at the beginning of the year, contract year, which is May 1 through April. But throughout the year, it's probably going to trend towards the second through service disruptions. Again, if demand is too low for a specific port pair, the direct services may be canceled. And again, simply the spread between BCO, or not BCO, the large fixed contracts and spot cannot be too high. Like something's got to give. And I do not think that means that fixed contracts will be dropped to spot rate levels, because that would be extremely unsustainable for shipping lines.
Very clear. What do you think, Kaitlyn? Would you agree or disagree?
Obviously, I'm going to agree with Nerijus. He is always, the one preaching the word of the wise to me. I will say, though, from a client perspective, if you're listening to this and debating what are your plans for the year, some of my clients that have already kind of committed to their plans for the 2023 calendar year, they're saying, look, I'm going to play fully on the spot market this year. There's some risk that, rates might get high in the back half of the year. But for those clients, it's because their company priority right now is managing costs and maximizing margin where they can. And that is the company's short-term priority. If you're still sitting on a lot of inventory that you paid a lot of money for to get it here in the US, cost is king right now. And so playing the spot market, rates are really low, getting your costs under control in the first half of this calendar year is a top priority for a lot of shippers at the moment. And so they're going to play the spot market, knowing there's some risk that rates could go up in the back half, but that's an important priority to them. In that case, I'd say keep going on the spot market. For those customers that are looking for a little bit more stability in their supply chain, they need to be able to forecast costs to their CFOs. If they're a company that works with a lot of buyers and planners internally, and those buyers and planners need to be able to have some degree of an accurate costing mechanism to plan through the end of the year, then perhaps fixed makes a bit more sense for those cases. So again, it's a bit case by case, but those are a few examples of clients I've been chatting with that feel confident in their strategy to say, cost is king right now, I'm going to play the spot market, or hey, stability, consistency, predictability into the future for the next 12 months is more important to me. So I'm willing to pay, in some cases, a bit more right above the current spot market just to lock in a fixed rate for the year and be able to rely on that.
Makes total sense. Let's hear from the audience. It can be pretty overwhelming. You've probably all been scarred a lot the past couple of years with the crazy market out there. There's a lot of information. There's a lot of movements in the market. So based on sort of what you know right now, love to learn a little bit more about your gut feel. So based on sort of how the markets is settling at the moment, are you leaning on signing more or less of your volume on fixed contracts relative to what you did in the past couple of years? So let's get a vote on either of the four options here. Do you plan to sign more volume on fixed contracts, less volume on fixed contracts relative to the past, give or take the same, or don't plan to sign any fixed contracts whatsoever? Let's take a moment to get some roads right here, and let's see. All right, let's see. Interesting. A third don't plan to sign any fixed contracts. 15% more, and then 30% less, 20% the same. Any surprises, Kaitlyn, Nerijus?
You know, we were joking, audience, before that I thought that there would be a fifth option that we should add here, which is I still don't know what I want to do yet this year, which I think the concern was that everybody might just pick that one because that's probably how I would be, feeling potentially at the moment. It is interesting to see the number of people that are saying, hey, I don't plan to sign any, or I plan to sign less. That's a clear indication to me that, our shippers do expect spot market levels to stay low. Perhaps, the attendees of this webinar also don't have a great outlook on the economy over the next year, which makes me also a bit concerned. But hey, where the spot market levels are right now, I'm not surprised at all. Like I was saying before, a lot of our supply chain managers and leaders are under a lot of pressure internally to manage costs in the very short term, keep them as low as possible. And where the spot market is right now, not surprising that a lot of our attendees are looking to play the spot market and potentially not lock in fixed contracts. Nerijus, what about from your perspective?
Yeah, not too surprised answer given the price levels being offered on fixed versus floating. Would like to see how this poll looks like in 2 or 3 weeks when the rates are actually final and settled.
Right.
But not unexpected.
Yeah, of course, it's always subject to price at the end of the day. Okay, but super interesting. Let's pivot and look at some of the trends we're seeing and hearing out there. So it's been pretty interesting for me being sort of on the road the past couple of weeks, talking to a lot of shippers and clients out there, learning about what trends they're seeing and forecasting for their supply chain. I think we're not going to see any sort of serious movements when it comes to nearshoring and whatnot, but I did get some interesting insight from at least a handful of clients who told me that in the beginning of this year, their footprint in terms of volume was give or take 70% out of China and then 30% Southeast Asia and India. And they expect to turn that around by end of year with 70% of their volume coming out of China and 70% out of Southeast Asia and India. That's probably the extreme, but nevertheless, it was interesting insight, and I was actually surprised to hear that big of a change for some of the clients in the mention. They were large shippers, so that was at least a super exciting takeaway or interesting takeaway for me. Anything else you're hearing out there on trends, Kaitlyn and Nerijus?
I echo your sentiment on the supplier diversification push. I think prior to COVID, there was it was like China plus one strategy of a lot of companies that were exclusively sourcing out of China were adding at least one more country into their supplier base. Some companies had that put on hold, especially with travel, locked down for a couple of years though, but I am starting to see and hear customers accelerate. Maybe it's China plus two or China plus 2 or 3 and looking to add exactly what you said. India into the mix is always popular. Vietnam, Southeast Asia, Taiwan, a little bit of Mexico. We're seeing more and more Mexico across the board there. So that's an interesting trend. And then on the US side, if you were a company that only had, let's say, one warehouse in Los Angeles prior to COVID, you likely now have a couple. And that seems to be a trend that customers want to keep, that, hey, I actually don't want to be solely reliant on just, the West Coast ports. I want to be able to use or leverage West Coast or central warehousing options as well.
Yeah, lots of uncertainty, I would say. Yeah. People are diversifying, and when you diversify, you essentially always need something that you don't have today. You need to find the best option, which Anders, I think, is a good segue into other slide, which is very to this. So what this basically shows you is that freight forwarders are gaining share in the last 6 months. And why so? Remember the last slide was showing diversification, right? If you're changing your supplier, very often means changing a sourcing, which means the best carrier from that supplier may not be the one you used in the past. It may be, but may not be. So that's one of the reasons why NVOs are actually gaining momentum. The number two reason why is NVOs react faster to market changes, right? We're seeing a lot of blank sailings, in some cases over 30%, depending on the trade lane. Actually, on Asia-Europe, one of the weeks was more than 40%. So when one alliance or one carrier has a blank sailing, a freight forwarder very quickly gives you another offer. Then carriers may launch new services, like with longer service loops by adding new port pairs. Haiphong was not a port of loading directly, and now it is. Well, freight forwarders will very quickly announce this to every importer, and importers are essentially gaining something they wouldn't otherwise. So adding value is the main reason why forwarders are gaining share. I expect this trend to continue well into 2023 and even possibly into 2024, or at least until we see some sort of stability. As long as there is mess, prices are going down, no up, or service being canceled, I believe freight forwarders will continue gaining share. And last thing I'll say on this is diversification often means you are sourcing from tougher to source regions in terms of ocean freight services, such as Indian subcontinent, right? India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or Sri Lanka, or South America. And those areas tend to have a larger NVO popularity, so to speak, simply because they are not as simple as shipping from Shanghai to Los Angeles. If you're shipping from Mundra in India to New York, your supplier is likely located somewhere in the middle of India. You need to source rail contracts that can be or doesn't always have to be part of the ocean freight. So again, adds complexity, which is why we see NVOs gaining momentum.
Super interesting. Thanks for sharing, Nerijus. Okay, we've talked a lot about the market. We've talked a lot about contracting options, rate scenarios, and whatnot. But there's a lot more to it when going out there and essentially launching an RFP or a bid. So, Kaitlyn, based on your experience, what's sort of your best advice to any shippers considering a bid or maybe being in the midst of a bid at the moment? What to look out for?
Yeah, I mean, my best advice here is I feel for those clients out there that do big, fixed contracts with, 50, 100, 150 rows worth of data that we're pricing out for you. Sometimes we can get caught up on, $10, $20 on a given line item here or there. Of course, my best advice is let's take a big step back, look at the big picture of what are you trying to achieve in your RFP process. Of course, anybody who's running an RFP is going to care about price, and that's an important consideration without a doubt, making sure that you're doing right by your company, you're getting, a good and fair price for the services that you're receiving. But really, of course, I'm going to recommend that we take a step back and look at what are the other things that you're going to get from your service provider during that year. So, for example, are you getting, full customer support? Do you have dedicated account management teams, people that are going to be responsive? If your strategies change, for example, you decide to add additional sourcing locations or warehouses in the US, do you have a team that's going to be responsive and helpful with network design, with strategy, and really support your needs there? Of course, tech-enabled workflows and visibility. Do you have a technology platform that gives you the data, the visibility, the updates that you need when you need it? Related to that, transparency and costs and reporting, so that when you're doing your landed cost analysis, do you know exactly what you're paying, why you're paying for it? Is there consistency in rates? If not, why not? How do we continue to improve our costing overall? And then, like I said before, just a true end-to-end solution that's going to help you, really maximize the needs of your business with your providers for the calendar year. Anything additional from your end, Anders or Nerijus?
Yeah, Nerijus, any pitfalls to look out for? Anything you've seen from the past?
Yes, which I actually will cover with the last slide, basically with key suggestions for RFPs. So maybe let me just take this away. Thank you,
Perfect.
Kaitlyn. Number one, take advantage of lower spot rates. While that is a short-lived advice, if you want to sign fixed contracts, you have roughly 2 weeks or so. So take it while it lasts. If you're considering to sign fixed contracts, big BCOs are already signing, and I think we are going to be next. I think most of fixed contracts will have to be finalized before mid-April, actually probably the first week of April. So have that in mind. Second advice is consider fixed rate levels, seasonality, peak season when you determine the strategy. It's not possible to say what is better until you see the final rate for each option. Well, because the final rounds have been launched but haven't always been filled by freight forwarders and carriers. Carriers, certain IPIs may also be better on spot than fixed. So every situation is unique. Work with your freight forwarder and in those cases ask for advice. Number three, don't rule PSS out. PSS is a peak season surcharge. It's there to help you. Remember what happened in 2020 for importers that have these cheap contracts relatively to what happened in the spot market and had no PSS clause, ended up paying the spot market for a bunch of their cargo. If there is no peak anyways, you will not have to pay it. And if there is, you will save money anyways, because spot market will go significantly above what the carriers would charge on the PSS. So don't rule that out. It sounds appealing, but it may actually be worse for you long term. Fixed and floating ratio. Like Kaitlyn mentioned, see what's best for your business. I personally would probably leave a larger portion on the spot this year than usual. Still expect majority of the TPEB to be moving on the fixed rate levels. In the past, probably 60-70% of Trans-Pacific, I'm talking pre-pandemic, was moving on fixed. During pandemic, it was significantly less, but let's leave that out. This year, I expect that to be spot. I expect to be more than it was pre-pandemic. The number 5, carriers are opening more IPIs for pricing. So review your routings. Previously, you were told that Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or Huntsville, or Nashville is not an option because carriers don't want empty equipment going into those difficult to reach areas. Well, now they are. It doesn't always mean these areas are cheap, but they are opening up. So ask your freight forwarder for these options. And the last one is determine how you want to hit your what your financial goals are, and if the market gets there, just go for it. At the end of the day, if the market is 1,500, 1,600, or 1,400, if you look at the cost per SKU for many importers, not all, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't materially change your cost. But if you're hitting your financial goals, again, just go for it. The last thing I'll say is service levels are going to be considerably better if you pay what the carriers load on the vessel, basically an average. So let's just take the largest 5 importers in the country. If they pay on a hypothetical lane $1,000, if you pay under that and a ship is full, guess what happens to your cargo? It probably leaves on the next sailing. If you're paying $50 or $100 more than them, then your cargo will be treated better. We're not talking about thousands of dollars like last year, like 2021, 2022, right? People were paying $20,000, $30,000 in some cases. $100 can meaningfully change your loading priority on a ship. That would be my biggest advice.
Yeah, that's a good call. So especially not treating all shipments, all volume the same, but where do you need more reliability and whatnot. Yeah, and then I think just a very simple piece of advice, make sure you ask a lot of tough questions. And if you don't get good answers, then ask them again. Don't take anything for granted. We're right at time.
And before you wrap, I just remember one more thing. You remember, if it's too good to be true, it probably is. And if you see a rate level from someone that is lower than what you would get from a shipping line, that should make you think. How can someone who doesn't own an asset have a rate that is better than a shipping line would offer you directly? In those cases, my advice would be that this is one gambling, and gambling is better in Vegas than here. So don't necessarily do that. And if you are interested in more so like gambling, or maybe gambling is not the right word, or taking some risk, then you would probably be better off playing a spot market than taking a fixed rate that's not backed by any asset owners. So be cautious of that. Sorry, Anders, back to you.
No, spot on. Yeah, either a spot or an index-based contract. Yeah. Okay, thanks so much for listening in. Thanks to Kaitlyn and Nerijus for essentially leaving all their expertise with all of us. And please follow up with any of us if you have any other questions. Thanks.
Thank you.